Welcome back. So let's talk a little bit more about the possible outcomes of hypothesis testing. There's four possible outcomes in terms of correctness and mistakeniness. And I've got a specific example for us to think about. So in any trial, a defendant is assumed to be innocent, and the prosecuting attorney must present evidence that proves guilt beyond all reasonable doubt. So being assumed to be innocent, remember it's the null hypothesis that's the one that we assume is true. So in this situation, we could say that the null hypothesis is the claim that the defendant is innocent, and then that would mean that the alternate hypothesis, the one that the prosecuting attorney is trying to support, is that the defendant is actually guilty. Now let's kind of organize the possible outcomes into a chart here. Now remember, there's two different things. The conclusion or verdict, that's an opinion, hopefully based on evidence, but it's an opinion. Whereas there's also reality. Okay, what's actually true in reality. And what we're doing with hypothesis testing or with a trial is we're hoping that our conclusion agrees with reality. Well, sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. Okay, so possibilities here. It could be that the verdict comes out as not guilty. Okay, and that means we are not rejecting the null hypothesis. Okay, right? Because the null hypothesis is that the defendant is innocent. So if you say not guilty, you're not rejecting that possibility. Okay. If it is in fact true that this person is innocent, so remember, H naught is the claim that the defendant's innocent. H1 is the claim that the defendant is guilty. If in reality it's actually true that the defendant is innocent and the jury says not guilty, then you've got a correct conclusion. The verdict or decision agrees with reality. Or if it's in fact true that in reality the defendant's guilty and the verdict is guilty, then again you have a correct decision. Okay, the guilty verdict agrees with the reality that the defendant is guilty. And guilty means you've rejected the null hypothesis, right? The null hypothesis is that the defendant is innocent. If you reject that, you're going to say guilty. Just a quick note about the way we talk about this stuff. We're never going to claim that we've proved the null hypothesis. Even if we don't reject it, we're not going to say we've proved it, right? You don't have to prove innocence. What you have to support or prove, at least beyond a reasonable doubt in a trial, is the alternate hypothesis. Now, notice that in terms of rejecting or not rejecting a hypothesis, we always are rejecting or not rejecting the null hypothesis. But the way we say our conclusion is in terms of the alternate hypothesis. So the verdict comes back, it doesn't say guilty or innocent, it says not guilty or guilty. So it's kind of a subtle semantic difference here. You don't say innocent because that can't be proved, but if you don't reject innocence, then you're going to say not guilty. If you do reject innocence, then you're going to say guilty. So the null hypothesis is either rejected or not rejected. And then the statement of the conclusion is always it's worded in terms of the alternate hypothesis, the hypothesis that someone was trying to prove or support. So the statement of conclusion is always going to refer to this one. But when we talk about rejecting or not rejecting a hypothesis, we do it in terms of the null hypothesis. Okay, what are those type 1 errors? Well, those types of errors. Well, we said a type 1 error was rejecting the null hypothesis when in fact the null hypothesis is true. So this, if that happens, you've got a type 1 error. So if the jury says guilty when in fact the defendant is innocent, that's a type 1 error. So you can think of a type 1 error as convicting an innocent person. Type 2 error, we said, was not rejecting the null hypothesis when in fact it's the true one, when in fact, not rejecting the null hypothesis when in fact it's the other hypothesis that's true, the alternate. So that's a type 2 error. And therefore you can think of a type 2 error as letting a guilty person go free. Okay, and of course in our criminal justice system, we are more concerned about making a type 1 error. You know, we're set up. That's why we set up. We're set up to assume a person's innocent until proven guilty. You have to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt, because we want to make sure that if at all possible we avoid type 1 errors, even though lowering the possibility of making a type 1 error, you know, by how your system is set up, that's going to increase the possibility of making a type 2 error. And so you have to decide which one, you know, where's the balance, which one is I mean, we've decided this one's more important, but how do you set things up so that there's a good balance between those two types of error? Okay, and then just to finish up this example with writing down some of what I was saying about the terminology or the way we talk about this. The defendant is never declared innocent, only guilty. Okay, and again, guilty means rejecting the null hypothesis of innocence. Or not guilty, which means that we do not reject the null hypothesis of innocence. Which is what you know, an ordinary person thinks of as not guilty. They think of that as innocent. There's a subtle difference there in what's intended by the two wordings. Again, we don't say we can prove innocence. We simply reject we don't reject the null hypothesis, so we're essentially rejecting the alternate hypothesis. Similarly, hypothesis testing does not allow us, so now back to the general idea of hypothesis testing, it does not allow us to declare the null hypothesis H not as true. We either reject or do not reject that null hypothesis. Okay, so we never claim to have proved it. We either say the evidence leads us to reject it or not to reject it. Okay, so that's all a little different from how people talk in real life. So let's give you a chance to sort of wade through these ideas with an example for yourself, build your understanding. Again, please, please, please think about this and do your best on it before you come back to the next video and watch us do it together. So a pharmaceutical company has just developed a new antibiotic for children. 2% of children taking a competing antibiotic experience headaches as a side effect. A researcher wants to know if the percent of children that experience headaches as a side effect when taking the new antibiotic is greater than 2%. So the researcher conducts a hypothesis test with the null hypothesis being that the proportion is still 0.02, 2%, and his alternate hypothesis is that the proportion is greater than 2%, 0.02. So that's what he's investigating. What would a type 1 error be in this situation? What would a type 2 error be? Okay, so I'll let you think about that, and we'll come back and decide on those together in the next video. See you then.